All right, ready and go.
I was just a boy. I was about a foot shorter, 30 or 40 pounds lighter, no facial hair. I was innocent. And I also had the chicken pox. That 2-week long, unexpected, unplanned break from school that consisted of picking at red bumps and constant fever and occasional vomiting. Not an extremely fun time. A lot of boredom. And my parents just bought a DVD player. We were probably 3 or 4 years behind the curve of everyone else buying a DVD player, because that's just the way we are. But so we had this DVD player. My dad had bought a couple movies that he were kind of a big part of his life as he was growing up. And so I knew I wasn't supposed to be watching PG-13 rated R movies, but I was like, I'm bored out of my mind. I'm gonna watch some movies right now. Long story short, I was exposed to obscene adult images for the first time in my life, which led to several years of addiction, which led to depression, anxiety. Basically, something was stolen from me that day. And the thing that was stolen from me that day was my innocence. If you can't relate to that specific experience, I know you can still relate to the common human experience of loss. We've all lost something. We've all encountered the enemy. We've all lost family, friends, friendships, joy, peace, love, all these different kind of things. We've all lost something. And Bartimaeus was a man in the Bible who had also lost something. Bartimaeus lived in Jericho at the same time that Jesus was making his way to Jerusalem. Jesus would enter Jerusalem to the praises of the people, and 3 days later he would be crucified. Several days later he would raise from the dead. But Bartimaeus lived in Jerusalem at the same time that Jesus was passing through. And Bartimaeus had once been able to see. He had once been able to work with his hands, which was really important in those days. Because if you weren't able to work with your hands, you really didn't have a way to make a living. He was once able to see the faces of his family and friends, to see sunrises, sunsets, to see the blue sky, the rain, to see the bustling life of Jericho. He once had the ability to enjoy life, to dream, to hope, and all these hopes and dreams were set on the ability to be able to see. And in some time as he was growing up, because of the unsanitary conditions, dust in the air, the glare of the sun, a lot of people would actually contract eye infections. And so he probably had an eye infection that led to his blindness. And now, every day, a friend or a family member would lead him to the same spot in the road where he would sit with a robe across his lap, and people who were passing by on that road to Jerusalem, worshipers and merchants, would give him money. This is what his life was now. And I wonder if some of you can relate to Bartimaeus. Perhaps you've lost something valuable. Perhaps you've been relegated to a lifestyle that is an extraordinarily lower form of living than what you were created for because of your dysfunction. Maybe you can't enjoy life like you once were able to. Maybe you can't do the things you once were able to do. You can't dream the dreams you once dreamed. You can't have the same hopes. And we pick up the story in Mark 10:46. And they, Jesus and his disciples, came to Jericho. And as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples in a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. So Bartimaeus had been sitting by the roadside. If anybody knew the talk of the town, Bartimaeus knew the talk of the town. Because he was sitting by the road between Jerusalem and Jericho, right outside of Jericho. And so he would hear the talk, he would hear the buzz all day long. And so he had heard, all he had been hearing for these several days was about Jesus. Because Jesus and his disciples had come into town. They probably spent the night or had been there maybe a few days, maybe miracles were happening. But undoubtedly, all anybody was talking about was Jesus. They were talking about the miracles that he had been doing. They were talking about the blind being healed, the crippled being able to walk. They were talking about how he taught with authority, how he confronted the religious system of the day. They were talking about the messianic signs and the rumor that he was actually of the line of David. And they were talking about how Jesus was headed to Jerusalem to establish his kingdom, at least those who believed. And so this brought up a new thought for Bartimaeus. And that thought was, what if? What if I could be healed? What if I encountered Jesus and he healed me the same way he healed those other blind people? And he began to imagine what life could be like if he got his sight back. And hope began to stir in him. And he actually began to despise his current lifestyle of powerlessness, of begging. So he formed a plan. Jesus would walk by. He knew that Jesus had to walk by on that road on his way to Jerusalem. And he was going to call out. And if he had his way, he was going to be healed. And he wasn't going to miss his opportunity. Maybe you've been hearing things. Maybe you've been hearing stories about Jesus restoring things, about people having encounters with Jesus. And you've been thinking, what if that happened to me? What would my life look like? What if I could dream again? What if I could hope again? What if I could do the things that I used to love to do again? Maybe you're like Bartimaeus. You're starting to make a plan. You're starting to become determined that you're not going to miss your opportunity. It was likely morning. Jesus and his disciples had a 15-mile trek ahead of them, and they were probably going to stop along the way. There's a bunch of people surrounding him. And Bartimaeus is sitting on the side of the road. Maybe he's been there for an hour or two, and he begins to hear the thundering of 1,000 footsteps, the clamoring of 1,000 voices. And he begins to ask those around him. He thinks this is probably Jesus, but he wants to make sure. He asks the people around him who can see what's going on, who is coming down the road? And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. His hand had been dealt, and he was all in. He began to shout, but he didn't just shout once. He kept shouting. And he would keep shouting until something happened or hope was gone. This began to bother the people who were passing by. Some of those people believed in Jesus and they wanted to save the proclamation of Son of David for him being enthroned. Some of those people saw this saying Son of David as putting Jesus' life at risk because of the Roman leaders or the religious authorities. And some of them didn't believe in Jesus, and they didn't want people saying that that Jesus was the Son of God. And so many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Maybe you've been sensing that your opportunity is approaching. I would say to you, start shouting. And keep shouting until something happens or hope is gone. Give it everything you have, and let the resistance that comes against you, maybe from other people, let that be the thing that launches your passion forward. Jesus didn't mind the noise. In verse 49, it says, "And Jesus stopped and said, 'Call him.' And they called the blind man, saying, 'Take heart, get up, he is calling you.'" Jesus cared for his cry. The faith of Bartimaeus moved Jesus. And Jesus commanded the very people who were rebuking him to call him. God responds to the brokenhearted. Psalm 34:18, he is near to the brokenhearted. He cares for your cry. Your faith moves his heart. And sometimes he'll use the very people who have hurt you and rebuked you to call you into your encounter. Be aware of that. Continuing in verse 50, "And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus." So Bartimaeus is sitting there with his robe across his lap, coins in his lap. He's probably having a really good day as far as getting money. There's this big crowd. They're excited. They're feeling generous. A lot of them want him to shut up. One way people get other people to shut up is to give them money. Just saying. But he didn't care for it anymore. No matter how much money he had in his lap, he really didn't care. Because he had this hope that what was stolen from him could be restored. And so he didn't care for this life that he had been living. So when he gets up, he doesn't just place the robe gently to the side, thinking, I'm going to go to Jesus. If this doesn't work out, I'll come back. I'll pick up where I left off. No, he's sitting on the ground and he throws the robe off. Coins fly everywhere in the dirt. Other people are picking them up. Some of them are lost. Some people are thinking, what are you doing? This is perfectly good money. You need this. Maybe you're not doing too bad with the low level of life that you've been relegated to, in contrast with what God's called you to. Maybe things are looking up. Maybe you've invented mindsets and strategies for revival or for survival. But I want to say to you today, don't settle. Don't settle for a life of powerlessness that is rooted in dysfunction when an opportunity for a new lifestyle of power and freedom has been set before you. And don't place that lower form of life to the side gently. Throw it off. Rid yourself of strategies and mindsets that are based in fear. Maybe you need to burn some bridges. Maybe you need to forgive some people. Maybe you need to move somewhere else. Maybe you need to rethink your theology or get serious about unhealthy habits and mindsets. But the motivation has to be to encounter Jesus. The motivation of throwing off the old has to be that I am going to leap up, I am going to find my way to Jesus, and I know I have my heart set, I have my faith and my hope set on Him healing me, on Him restoring me, on Him enabling me to live the life that I was created to live. Continuing in verse 51, "And Jesus said to him, 'What do you want me to do for you?' And the blind man said to him, 'Rabbi, let me recover my sight.'" So Jesus gives him an opportunity to show that he is all in, to make a final yes. And he also gives him an opportunity, he invites him into relationship. He says, "Bartimaeus, I care what you have to say. I care what you're thinking. I care about your motivations, and I want to hear it from your mouth." And I believe that he gives each of us the opportunity to show whether or not we're really hungry for the abundant life that he's promised to us. To really say yes. I think he asks us every day, "What do you want me to do for you?" And it's actually one of the most important questions that we can answer. Let's follow Bartimaeus' example, and let's not settle for anything less than what he created us for. And let's keep in mind that when he asks us, what do you want me to do for you? He's inviting us into relationship. He wants to hear your thoughts. He wants to hear your voice. He wants to hear it straight from your mouth. He wants to know what's going on inside of you. And Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. You see, the only reasonable thing to do when Jesus restores us is to follow him. Bartimaeus had found a new reason for living, to see the Son of David enthroned. I'd imagine that Bartimaeus was leading Israel in praise as the disciples, as Jesus and his disciples entered into Jerusalem, saying, "This is the Son of David. This is the Son of David. I was blind and now I see." That as Jesus was being tried, he was not among those saying, "Crucify him." As Jesus was on the cross, he was not among those mocking him. And as Jesus was in the grave, he was not among those laughing. He was among those weeping. Now I'd imagine that as Jesus was raised from the dead, he was not among those doubting, he was among those believing, and that as Jesus appeared and ascended, he was not among those who were unaware, he was among those who actually saw Jesus. And that as the Spirit came upon the church in power, he's not among those observing, he was among those continuing the work that Jesus had started. And the only reasonable thing to do for us when Jesus restores us is to follow him in the same way. We follow him through trial, we follow him through tribulation, through confusion, through distress. I'm sure that the kingdom didn't look like what Bartimaeus expected it to look. But he had had an encounter, he had had what was stolen from him restored to him, and so he was going to follow Jesus to the end. And we follow Jesus to the end because when we cry out, he cares to hear our cry. And he calls us. And when we throw off the old and leap up and run toward him, he restores us every time. He restores everything. At the beginning of my message, I mentioned an addiction that I had in my youth that stole away my innocence. And one day, several years after that started, after following sin's orders once again, I was broken. I recognized that I couldn't shake this thing on my own. And so I remember vividly as I was 13, getting on my knees, tears in my eyes, and basically saying, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." It's not the exact prayer that I prayed, but that's what my heart was saying. I was done with the low life that I had been relegated to because of my dysfunction. And I wasn't going to miss my opportunity. I started shouting and I kept shouting. I wasn't going to settle for the low life. I had heard too much of what Jesus does to settle. And that served as a turning point for me where God began to restore that. And he's done a really good job at that because he's really good at what he does. He stopped for me. He called me and he restored what was stolen, and because of that, I'm going to follow him for the rest of my life. So what I would really want you to take away from this today is don't settle. Don't settle for a life of powerlessness that is based in dysfunction when an opportunity for a new lifestyle of power and freedom has been set before you. Start shouting, keep shouting, and he will restore you. Thanks.